The United States of America, land of opportunity, home of the brave, but along the highways, tucked into urban parks, and lining the banks of our great rivers, a new kind of city is rising, America's tent cities. These aren't temporary shelters after a natural disaster. They are permanent, sprawling encampments, a stark, visceral declaration of a national crisis. In a nation of unparalleled wealth, how has this become the unfiltered new reality? We're taking a raw, uncompromising look at the growing shame of the tent city phenomenon, exploring its roots, its devastating reality, and the systemic failures that created the largest homeless population since the Great Depression. The cartography of crisis, mapping the modern Hooverville. America's tent cities are more than just clusters of canvas and plastic. They are complex, often desperate communities that have become an indelible fixture on the landscape of modern American life. The sheer scale is staggering. In 2024, the nation's total homeless population reached a record high, with over 2 million individuals experiencing homelessness on any given night, an 18% spike from the previous year. Crucially, while cities like New York have a high shelter population due to right-to-shelter laws, it is the sprawling metropolises of the West Coast, Los Angeles, Seattle, Oakland, Portland, that bear the scars of the largest unsheltered populations. In these cities, over 60% of unhoused people are sleeping on the streets, under tarps, or in vehicles. The growth is not limited to major cities. Suburbs and even rural areas are seeing exponential increases. This is a coast-to-coast epidemic, a creeping socioeconomic blight that signifies a deep rupture in the American social contract. The communities within these encampments are often self-governing, born out of a desperate need for security in numbers. They develop their own internal economies, their own unwritten rules, and their own defense mechanisms against the constant threat of sweeps and violence. They represent a withdrawal from the mainstream, not always by choice, but by exclusion. The names themselves tell a story. The Zone in Phoenix, the encampments at Snake beneath I-5 in Seattle, or the infamous Skid Row in Los Angeles. These are not hidden corners. They are often highly visible, existing in the shadow of corporate towers and luxury condos, a daily, unavoidable confrontation for the housed population. They are a monument to economic disparity, a haunting reminder that in the fifth decade of the 21st century, millions of Americans are being pushed to the absolute fringe of survival. The geography of homelessness is a geography of systemic failure. The perfect storm, unmasking the true causes. The popular narrative often simplifies homelessness to individual moral failings, addiction, or mental illness. While individual challenges are certainly present, they are symptoms, not the root cause, of the tent city explosion. The primary driver of this crisis is a monumental failure of the housing market. Since 1970, the number of affordable and available rental homes for every 100 extremely low-income renter households has plummeted. Today, only 37 affordable homes exist for every 100 households in need. This is a 63% deficit, an unbridgeable chasm. That means even if a person has a job, and alarmingly, 40 to 60% of unhoused individuals are in fact employed, they cannot afford rent. The federal minimum wage, stagnant for years, has rendered even a 40-hour work week insufficient to rent a one-bedroom apartment in any county in the entire country. A minimum wage worker would need to work over 86 hours a week just to afford a modest home. The second major contributor is the inadequate social safety net. The deinstitutionalization of mental health patients, beginning in the 1950s, was intended to shift care to community-based centers, but the promised funding for those centers never fully materialized. This created a generation of vulnerable individuals with severe mental health issues left to navigate a world without the necessary clinical support, often leading them directly to the streets. Furthermore, the criminal justice system plays a devastating role. People who have served time in prison are 10 times more likely to experience homelessness, often due to the difficulty of finding employment and housing with a criminal record. The cumulative effect of these systemic failures, unaffordable housing, cuts to social programs, and the cycle of incarceration, is what forces people into the unsheltered, visible desperation of a tent city. It's a chain reaction where one crisis, like a sudden medical bill or job loss, hits an already financially precarious individual, leaving them with absolutely nowhere to go but AT. And the daily battle, life inside the encampments. To truly understand America's tent cities, one must grasp the harsh reality of daily life within them. It is a constant, exhausting battle for survival. The conditions are brutal. Unsanitary environments where disease spreads rapidly. Lack of access to clean water, sanitation, and waste removal creates public health crises not only for the residents, but for the surrounding communities. Tent cities often become vectors for hepatitis A and other infectious diseases. The lack of basic infrastructure means that simple necessities, a shower, a toilet, a safe place to store one's few possessions, become insurmountable luxuries. Perhaps the greatest threat is violence and vulnerability. Women, in particular, face extremely high rates of sexual assault and violence. People in tent cities live in constant fear of theft, drug-related violence, and predatory behavior. The life expectancy for someone experiencing homelessness is approximately 30 years shorter than the average American, a staggering statistic that speaks volumes about the deadly conditions. Furthermore, the lack of medical care means easily treatable illnesses become life-threatening emergencies. The stress, the trauma, and the sheer environmental hardship compound pre-existing mental health issues, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of despair. A person is not just homeless. They are enduring constant, multifaceted trauma. The environment of the encampment is a public health crisis masquerading as a housing crisis, and its residents are paying the ultimate price in years of life lost and immeasurable suffering. The policy paradox. Sweeps, solutions, and the Supreme Court. The response of American cities to the proliferation of tent cities has been, at best, a paradox of punitive measures and underfunded solutions. Many municipalities rely on encampment sweeps or the criminalization of homelessness through anti-camping ordinances. These policies, which make it illegal to sleep or sit in public spaces, do not solve homelessness. They simply displace it. When an encampment is cleared, residents are often forced to abandon their shelters and all their possessions, destroying the small amount of stability and community they had managed to build. Studies show that sweeps only exacerbate the problem, causing further trauma and making it harder for outreach workers to locate and connect individuals with services. The policy is, in effect, a moral failure that prioritizes the aesthetics of a city over the human rights of its residents. The legal landscape is being defined by landmark cases. Most recently, the Supreme Court's involvement in cases that could determine whether a city can punish unhoused individuals for sleeping outdoors when no shelter is available. Criminalizing a survival behavior, the act of sleeping, is viewed by advocates as cruel and unconstitutional, essentially punishing people for existing. On the positive side, a major evidence-based solution is gaining traction: housing first. This model, championed by organizations across the country, is brilliantly simple and profoundly effective. Give people a permanent, safe place to live without preconditions like sobriety or employment. Once the foundational need for housing is met, people can then more effectively access and utilize supportive services, such as mental health care, addiction treatment, and job training. Data has repeatedly demonstrated that housing first is not only more humane, but also cost-effective, as it drastically reduces the use of expensive emergency systems, hospital emergency rooms, and the criminal legal system. The cost of perpetually managing homelessness through emergency services and jails far outweighs the cost of simply housing people. The key is in the transition, moving away from short-sighted criminalization and toward comprehensive, long-term, housing-focused strategies. Sanctioned encampments, which provide basic sanitation and security while permanent housing is built, are a vital intermediate step, acknowledging the crisis while working toward a definitive solution. The invisible people, demographics of the unhoused. The face of homelessness is not monolithic, and the tent city phenomenon disproportionately affects marginalized communities, highlighting systemic racism and inequality. Black individuals, for example, constitute only 13% of the overall U.S. population, but they account for a shocking 37% of the entire homeless population and a full 50% of homeless individuals within family units with children. This disparity is a direct legacy of systemic racism, historical redlining, and inequitable access to opportunities that continue to push people of color out of the housing market. Similarly, indigenous communities experience disproportionately high rates of homelessness. Another vulnerable demographic is the LGBTQIA plus youth population, who are 120% more likely to experience homelessness than their heterosexual and cisgender peers, often after fleeing or being rejected by their families. Veterans, too, find themselves at a higher risk, struggling to transition from military service back to civilian life without adequate mental health and employment support. Furthermore, families with children represent a growing, alarming trend. After a decade of decline, family homelessness has seen a significant increase, rising by 16% in a single year. The image of a tent city is typically a single adult, but the reality is that the crisis is swallowing up families, veterans, and young people, tearing at the very fabric of America's future. The tent is not a choice. It is a final refuge for those failed by multiple, interlocking systems of inequality. The ethical imperative, beyond the frame. When we look at a photograph or a video of a tent city, it is easy to recoil, to look away, or to pass moral judgment. But the ethical imperative is to look deeper, to see the human being underneath the tarp. These are not statistics. They are neighbors, former co-workers, and fellow citizens who have been priced out, traumatized, or systematically excluded. The sheer visibility of the tent city crisis demands a new level of accountability from every level of government, from local city councils to the halls of Congress. Ending America's growing shame requires a commitment that matches the scale of the problem. It means massive investments in deeply affordable housing, not just market-rate housing, but units designated for the extremely low income. It means prioritizing the upstream prevention of homelessness, which involve providing emergency rental assistance, tenant protections, and targeted support for individuals leaving institutions like foster care or prison. It means fully funding mental and behavioral health care and coupling it with housing as housing-first advocates. It requires a fundamental shift in perspective, treating homelessness not as a criminal justice issue, but as a public health and affordable housing crisis. The most successful communities are those that engage with encampment residents, offering services and humane pathways to housing, rather than simply moving the problem down the street. The tent cities are a mirror reflecting the deepest failures of American society. The question is no longer if we can solve this problem, but if we have the collective political will and moral courage to look at the shame in our streets and finally choose to fix it. The human cost is too high for us to look away any longer.